You know the smell the moment you open the door. That heavy, damp, musty air of a house that has been shut up too long. The sour breath of a cellar. The sad, mildewed smell of clothes left folded in a damp chest. For a settler family, living in a log cabin with earth floors and no way to air the place through a long, wet winter, that dampness was a constant enemy. It ruined the food, rotted the cloth, and worst of all, it was believed to bring sickness into the home. But the settlers were not helpless against the damp and the must. They knew that certain plants, hung in the rooms, laid in the chests, and burned on the hearth, could drive out the musty smell and, in the old belief, cleanse the very air of the home. They filled their cabins with these fragrant guardians, turning damp, sour rooms into places that smelled clean and wholesome again. In the next half hour, I am going to show you 7 plants the settlers used to fight the mold and the musty smells in the home, where they used each one, how they worked, and why the dampness could not stand against them. And number 5 is a plant you very likely have in your garden right now, that the settlers burned on the hearth to cleanse a sick room and clear the air. To a settler family, a damp, musty home was more than unpleasant. It meant the food spoiled faster, the precious woolens grew mildewed and rotted, the leather cracked and went green. And in the old understanding, that heavy sour air was itself the carrier of sickness, the reason a family fell ill through the dark, wet months. To drive out the must was to guard the family's health. A quick and honest word before we begin. Everything I share here is history and tradition, offered for curiosity and for the love of old, fading knowledge. It is not medical advice, and it is not advice on treating mold, which is a real health matter for a professional. Some plants are potent, so never use any without proper knowledge. With that understood, let us step back in time. Welcome to the American Settler Garden, where we dig up the forgotten plant wisdom of America's pioneers. The families who fought the damp and the must in their homes with nothing but the fragrant plants they grew and gathered. To understand the settlers' war against the damp, you have to picture the cabin as it truly was. Timber walls, often an earth or rough plank floor, a single hearth, and windows sealed tight against the cold for months on end. Rain and snow outside, wet clothes drying within, the breath of a whole family, and often their animals too. There was nowhere for the moisture to go, and it settled into everything. So the settlers turned to the plants. They learned which herbs held a scent strong enough to overcome the sour must, which could be burned to fill a room with cleansing smoke, which laid among the cloth would keep the mildew from taking hold. This was not merely about pleasant smells. In their understanding, the fragrant plant was actively cleansing the bad air, and a sweet-smelling room was a healthy one. Much of this came from the old country, where fragrant herbs had been strewn and burned against foul air for centuries, and much from frontier necessity. Together it became the settlers' defense against the damp, and like so much of it, it faded when the dehumidifier and the bottled spray arrived. Today we remember it, beginning with the first plant. And as we go, notice that the settlers fought the damp in 3 distinct ways, and each plant had its place among them. Some were hung to fill the air day after day. Some were steeped into waters and wiped over the walls and shelves where the mildew crept. And some were burned, their smoke reaching every corner at once. 3 weapons, drawn from the same fragrant garden. Number 1. Lavender. The settlers reached for lavender first against the damp, because it fought on two fronts at once. It overcame the sour smell in the air, and it kept the mildew from taking hold in the folded cloth. For a family whose woolens had to survive a wet winter and still be fit to wear, that double protection was worth a great deal. Our beloved lavender returns, for among all the plants the settlers used against the musty air, none was more reached for. Its sweet, clean, powerful perfume could overcome the sour smell of damp better than almost anything, and it kept the mildew from the stored cloth besides. Settler families hung dried lavender through the rooms, tucked sachets of it into every chest and drawer where the damp threatened the woolens, and laid bunches in the corners where the air grew heavy and sour. The sweet scent filled the space and drove out the must, and in the chests it guarded the folded cloth from taking on that mildewed smell. A cabin hung with lavender smelled clean instead of damp. The rich, lasting aromatic oils of lavender are the source of its power, strong enough to overcome the sour smell of the damp and to keep a chest of woolens sweet through a wet winter. The settlers valued it above all for the linens and the bedding, the places where a musty smell was most miserable and most stubborn. It was a guardian of everything soft in the home. And there is something we should be honest about as we go. To the settlers, this was not simply about a home that smelled nice. In their understanding of the world, that heavy, sour, damp air was itself the thing that made people ill, and a fragrant, sweet-smelling room was a healthy one. Every bunch they hung was, in their minds, a guard on the family's health. And lavender freshened the home, calmed the spirit, guarded against the moths and the fleas, and drew the bees besides, beloved in every way. To use it as the settlers did, hang dried lavender through the rooms, and tuck sachets in every damp chest and drawer. The next plant was the clean, woody guardian of the air. Hung through the rooms and tucked in every chest, the lavender drove the sour damp from the air and kept the folded woolens sweet through the wettest winter. Number 2. Rosemary. The settlers valued rosemary through the wet season, above all because it never died back. When the January damp was at its worst, and every other herb in the garden was gone, the rosemary stood green outside the door, ready to be cut and hung wherever the air had turned heavy and sour. Rosemary, that fragrant needle-leaved herb with its strong, clean, piney scent, was one of the settlers' great weapons against the musty air of the home. That bracing, reviving smell cuts through the heavy, sour damp like little else, and the settlers used it freely wherever the air grew stale. Settler families hung bunches of rosemary through the cabin, especially near the hearth and in the corners where the damp settled, and laid sprigs of it in the chests and cupboards. They also steeped it into a strong rosemary water and wiped it over the damp walls, shelves, and surfaces where the mildew threatened. A room hung with rosemary smelled clean and bracing, and in the old belief, the very air was made wholesome by it. The powerful aromatic oils that fill rosemary's needles are the source of its clean, penetrating scent, strong enough to cut the heavy must and lasting long even when dried. The settlers valued rosemary especially because it was evergreen, giving its fragrant help all through the wet winter, when other herbs had died back and the damp was at its very worst. And the settlers fought hardest against the damp in the winter, which is exactly when it was worst and when they could do least about it. Sealed in against the cold, The family could not simply throw the windows open. The fragrant plants were the only tool they had to make a shut-up cabin bearable through months of wet cold. And rosemary was a treasured seasoning, a herb of memory and the old traditions, and a guardian against many pests besides, one of the hardest working plants of all. To use it as the settlers did, hang rosemary through the damp rooms and wipe a strong rosemary water over the surfaces. The next plant was the savory sentinel of the cellar. Hung through the damp rooms and wiped over the surfaces, the rosemary cut through the heavy must with its clean, bracing scent, green and ready even in deep winter. Number 3. Thyme. The settlers sent the thyme down into the cellar, the darkest and dampest place on the whole homestead, where the mildew took hold first and the air was heaviest. It was a small plant, given the hardest job in the house, and it held its own remarkably well. Thyme, that small-leaved, intensely fragrant herb, was one of the settlers' trusted plants against the damp and the must, valued especially for the cellar and the storeroom, where the air grew heaviest and the mildew took hold first. Its powerful, savory scent held its own against the sour dampness. Settler families hung bunches of dried thyme in the cellar, the pantry and the storerooms, and laid it along the damp shelves. They also steeped it into a fragrant water to wipe over the surfaces where the mildew threatened the stores. In the old traditions, thyme was held to be one of the great cleansing herbs, and a cellar hung with it was thought to have wholesome air rather than the sour breath of the damp. The aromatic oils packed into thyme's tiny leaves are the source of its power, remarkably strong for so small a plant, and holding their scent well even when dried through a long wet season. The settlers valued thyme for the darkest, dampest corners of the homestead, where the air was worst and a strong scented guardian was most needed. And the settlers guarded the cellar with particular care, for it held everything that had to last, and the mildew there would ruin the food and the family's whole winter. A sour cellar was not a small annoyance. It was the smell of provisions going bad. And thyme was a treasured seasoning, a herb of the old health traditions, and a guardian of the stores besides, one of the great kitchen herbs of the homestead. To use it as the settlers did, hang dried thyme in the cellar and damp storerooms, and wipe a thyme water over the shelves. The next plant was the silver herb of the sick room. Hung in the cellar and wiped along the shelves, the thyme held its savory guard in the dampest, darkest corners of the homestead. Number 4. Sage. The settlers turned to burning sage when a room had gone truly bad, after a sickness or a long shut-up season, when merely hanging a bunch would not do. The fragrant smoke reached everywhere at once, into the corners and the rafters, and to a settler family, it meant the room had been made right again. Sage, that soft, silvery herb with its warm, earthy, powerful aroma, held a special place in the settlers' fight against bad air. For sage was not merely hung to smell sweet, it was burned, its fragrant smoke filling the room, in the old belief that it cleansed and purified the very air of the home. Settler families hung sage through the cabin and, crucially, burned small bundles of the dried leaves, letting the aromatic smoke drift through the rooms, especially after sickness, in a damp season, or in a room that had been shut up too long. The practice of burning fragrant herbs to cleanse a space is one of the oldest in human memory, carried across cultures and centuries, and the settlers held to it firmly. A room smoked with sage was believed to be wholesome again. The strong aromatic oils in sage's leaves are the source of its scent, released powerfully when the dried leaf is burned, filling a whole room in moments and overcoming even the heaviest musty air. The settlers valued sage above almost everything for the sick room and the sour shut-up chamber, the places where they most feared the bad air, and they trusted its smoke to set things right. And the settlers made a distinction worth noticing. Some plants were hung to work slowly, day after day, and some, like the sage, were burned to work all at once when a room needed setting right immediately. Knowing which job called for which was part of the craft of keeping a home. And sage was a treasured seasoning, a herb of the old health traditions, and a guardian of the stores besides, among the great all-purpose plants of the settler garden. To use it as the settlers did, hang sage through the home and burn small bundles to let the fragrant smoke cleanse a damp or shut-up room. And now we come to the one I promised you. Hung through the home and burned in small bundles, the sage filled a sour or shut-up room with its cleansing smoke and, in the old belief, set the air right again. And now we reach number 5, the one I promised you. A plant you very likely have in your garden right now, that the settlers burned on the hearth to cleanse a sick room and clear the air. Number 5, eucalyptus. The settlers prized eucalyptus for the worst rooms of all, because its scent did not merely sit on top of the must, it cut straight through it. Where a gentler herb would be swallowed by heavy sour air, the eucalyptus filled the whole space and left it smelling clear. Eucalyptus, with its silvery leaves and its powerful, clean, penetrating scent, was one of the settlers' most valued plants against the damp and the musty air wherever they could grow or obtain it. That sharp, clearing, medicinal aroma cuts through heavy sour air like nothing else, and it was trusted deeply for the worst rooms in the house. Settler families hung bunches of eucalyptus through the damp rooms, and famously, in the room where the steam and warmth of the hearth or a kettle would release its clearing oils into the air. They laid it where the must was worst and hung it in the sick room, in the old belief that its penetrating scent cleansed the air and eased the chest and the breath. A room hung with eucalyptus smelled clear and clean instead of heavy and sour. The intensely strong aromatic oils of eucalyptus are the source of that unmistakable clearing scent, powerful enough to fill a whole room from a single hanging bunch and to hold that scent long after the leaves are dried. The settlers valued it as their most penetrating weapon against the heavy, musty air, reserved for the dampest and most troubled rooms of the home. And the settlers reserved their most powerful weapons, the eucalyptus and the burning sage, for the sick room above all, for that was where they most feared the bad air, and where they most wanted to believe something could be done. There is a real tenderness in that, a family doing everything it knew for someone lying ill. And eucalyptus was valued in the old traditions for the chest and the breath besides, its clean scent thought to clear and freshen. To use it as the settlers did, hang eucalyptus in the dampest rooms and where the warmth of the hearth will release its clearing scent. The next plant was the fragrant wood that never gave in. Hung in the worst rooms and near the warmth of the hearth, the eucalyptus cut straight through the heaviest musty air and left the room smelling clear. Number 6, cedar. The settlers loved the cedar chest for one reason above all others. It never needed refreshing. A bunch of herbs lost its power in a season and had to be replaced, but a cedar chest guarded the woolens quietly for 30 years, asking nothing at all. Cedar, that fragrant reddish wood with its warm, distinctive scent, was the settler's great guardian of everything that had to be stored through the damp. For cedar does something none of the herbs could do. Its scent never fades away for years on end, guarding quietly and faithfully long after a bunch of herbs would have lost its power. Settler families treasured chests of cedar for their woolens and blankets, and where a whole chest was beyond their means, they laid cedar shavings and blocks among the stored cloth. In the wet months, when everything folded away was at risk of coming out mildewed and sour, the cedar chest kept its contents smelling clean and sweet. It was often a family's most prized piece of furniture, guarding the clothing that had to last for years against both the moths and the must. The aromatic oils held deep in the cedar wood are the source of its power, released slowly across many years, filling a closed chest with a scent that the mildew and the musty air could never overcome. The settlers valued cedar above almost everything for the stored cloth, because it asked nothing at all and guarded on, faithful for a whole generation. And cedar was a beautiful, durable, fragrant wood besides, prized for building and for furniture that lasted a lifetime. A wood that made a fine chest and guarded its contents at once was treasured on every homestead. To use it as the settlers did, store your woolens in cedar or lay cedar blocks and shavings among the cloth. The final plant was the powerful spice of the corner. Built into chests or laid in blocks among the cloth, the cedar kept the woolens sweet and free of mildew, faithful and fragrant for a whole generation. Number 7. Cloves. We close with cloves, those small, dark, fragrant spice buds we treasure in baking, which the settlers used, where they could obtain this precious spice against the musty air and the mildew of the home. That warm, intensely powerful, spicy scent could overcome a sour room from a mere handful of buds. Settler families scattered cloves in the damp corners and cupboards, tucked them into the chests with the stored cloth, and famously studded them into citrus fruits to make the fragrant pomanders that were hung in the rooms, the closets, and the storerooms. A clove pomander hung in a damp cupboard filled it with a powerful warm scent that drove out the must, and in the old belief, kept the air wholesome. It was beautiful and useful at once. The intensely strong aromatic oil within the clove is the source of its remarkable power, so potent that even a few buds fill a whole cupboard with their scent, overcoming the heaviest musty smell. The settlers, to whom cloves were a rare and costly spice, used them carefully, but a single pomander guarded and perfumed a space for a very long time, well worth its price. And cloves, of course, were a beloved spice for baking and flavoring, valued in the old traditions besides, treasured in every way. A spice whose fragrant buds sweetened a damp corner, and the Christmas baking alike was a true kitchen treasure. To use it as the settlers did, scatter cloves in the damp corners and cupboards, or stud them into citrus, to hang where the air is sour. Scattered in the sour corners and studded into pomanders, the cloves overcame the must with their powerful warm scent, beautiful and potent at once. And there is something worth keeping from this old way. even now that we have machines to pull the water from the air. The settlers understood that a home has a smell, and that the smell tells you whether the place is cared for and wholesome or neglected and sour. To hang a bunch of lavender or rosemary in a damp corner is a small act of care that our grandmothers would have recognized instantly. So there you have it. 7 plants the settlers used to fight the mold and the musty smells in the home. Lavender, the sweet guardian of the damp chest. Rosemary, the clean bracing herb of the wet winter. Thyme, the savory sentinel of the cellar. Sage, the cleansing smoke of the sick room. Eucalyptus, the penetrating clearer of the worst air. Cedar, the fragrant wood that guarded a generation. And cloves, the powerful spice of the sour corner. Every one of them helped a settler family fight back against the damp that threatened their food, their cloth, and, as they believed, their very health, turning heavy sour rooms into places that smelled clean and wholesome, with nothing but hanging bunches, fragrant waters, cleansing smoke, and scented wood. The settlers could not buy their way out of the damp. They fought it with the fragrant plants of the garden. And these 7 are only part of the settler's art of keeping a home wholesome. As I dug into this, I found far more than I could fit into one video. The full fragrant arsenal the pioneers used to keep their homes clean, fresh, and free of trouble, all laid out in simple pages. I gathered it into a guide called The Settler's Guide to a Fresh and Wholesome Home. If you would like a copy to keep, the link is waiting for you down in the description below. And if you believe this old knowledge is worth keeping alive, worth passing on the way the settlers passed it on, then go ahead and subscribe. That is all it takes to see the next one. Because the damp was only one of the troubles that crept into a settler home. Next, I want to show you the plants that kept the bugs out of the settlers' stored food and grain, the guardians of everything that had to last the winter. That story is playing right here. Thank you for spending this time with me, and I will see you in the next one.